Who was the most influential person of the 20th century? Some would say Lenin, others Roosevelt or Churchill, and still others might mention Einstein or Muhammad Ali. But you have no idea how many of our current habits exist because of a man known only to a small circle of specialists. This man manipulated millions of people while staying completely in the shadows. He made enormous amounts of money, yet he never sought to appear on the pages of Forbes. He is considered the father of modern propaganda and everything related to public relations and advertising, a man without whom the modern world would be completely different. His name is Edward Bernays. Edward was born in 1891 in Vienna into a wealthy Jewish family. His grandfather was the chief rabbi of Hamburg, and his mother, Anna Freud, was the sister of Sigmund Freud. A year after Edward was born, his father moved the family to America, settling in New York, where he became a successful grain merchant. He hoped his son would follow a similar path. Edward attended a private school and earned a bachelor's degree in agriculture from Cornell University in 1912. But working the land didn't interest him at all. As Bernays himself admitted, he was far more fascinated by how seeds of ideas and thoughts planted in people's minds could influence their behavior. In 1913, Edward Bernays started working as a press agent on Broadway. His job was to place advertisements for theater productions in the Sunday newspaper to help sell tickets. The theater industry was still young, and the work was simple. Bernays and his colleagues had to persuade newspapers to write something positive and straightforward about a production, at least on the last pages. For example, the actors were good, the script made sense, and the costumes were beautiful. But Bernays had a different idea. Instead of promoting the actors or the play itself, he focused on the ideas behind the production and the social issues it addressed. In other words, he aimed to reach the audience emotionally. One day, actor Richard Bennett asked him to promote the play The Damaged Goods, which was about the lives of prostitutes. At that time, American society was still deeply puritanical. Bernays knew that a direct approach would fail, so he came up with something clever. He created what he called the Medical Committee of the Social Hygiene Foundation. The committee published articles about venereal diseases and the benefits of sexual education. In these articles, the play's title was mentioned subtly a few times. Bernays also involved influential figures such as John D. Rockefeller Jr., Franklin Roosevelt, then a senator from New York, and other respected leaders who recommended the production as highly educational. Once the public was ready, Bernays launched the regular advertising campaign, and the play premiered to huge success. Modern PR professionals call this technique a poisoned sandwich. The idea is that if you want to deliver a message to an audience, surround it with an interesting or useful story, and then embed your message inside. Another famous Bernays campaign was promoting the Russian ballet tours in America, the legendary Russian Seasons by Sergei Diaghilev. In the early 20th century, Russian ballet was only known in Europe. In the US, ballet seemed strange and even wild. To make the tours a success, Bernays had to prepare the American audience and convince them that every respectable American should attend a ballet performance. When he contacted magazine editors, they refused to print photos of the dancers because the skirts were above the knee. Bernays personally paid $600 to the costume designers to lengthen the skirts to an acceptable length. Then, he segmented the media, tailoring different stories for different audiences. In women's magazines, he highlighted the beauty of the costumes, the elegance of the dancers, and the vibrancy of the sets. In men's magazines, he focused on the dancers' grueling rehearsals. In the tabloids, sensational stories about the performers' lives and photos of dancers in revealing costumes appeared. Specialized journals published articles about music, composers, choreographers, and set designers. Throughout, the dancers were presented as representatives of a great ballet tradition, which was true. The campaign lasted almost 2 years. By the end, the Russian ballet had won the hearts of all America. The conservative nation loosened up through dance and began to see the body in a new way. Today, it's hard to imagine, but in the early 20th century, Russian ballet was almost a sexual revolution. But soon, the United States had no time for art. For almost the entire 19th century, America lived under the Monroe Doctrine. The US stayed out of Europe's affairs, and Europe, in turn, did not interfere in the Americas. In Europe, more than 60 wars and uprisings occurred over 100 years. In the same period, America, despite the Civil War, experienced far less bloodshed and violence. When World War I broke out in Europe, the United States remained neutral for a long time. But after the Germans sank several civilian ships with Americans on board and loans to the Allies exceeded $10 billion, money that could not be risked, the US entered the war. Bernays wanted to go to the front, but he was denied due to vision problems. Instead, friends introduced him to members of the Committee on Public Information, which was essentially the US propaganda department during World War I. The main task of the committee was to explain to citizens that the era of Monroe's isolationism was over. They needed to convince Americans that the country had to enter a war thousands of miles away from its borders. Bernays drew on the methods he had used on Broadway, but now he applied them to psychological warfare. His colleagues didn't always understand what he was doing. For example, when he was tasked with working with Italian-American soldiers, he didn't just repeat the usual message that the Germans were bad and needed to be defeated. Instead, he printed propaganda leaflets featuring famous Italians admired by the Italian-American community. The goal was to unite support for the Allies. In other words, Bernays appealed not to hatred of the Germans, nor just to Italian-Americans' loyalty to the US, but to their pride in their homeland. By 1918, Edward Bernays, at just 28 years old, traveled with President Wilson's delegation to the Paris Peace Conference, which marked the official end of World War I. Upon returning to the United States, Bernays realized that the methods of wartime propaganda he had used during the campaign could be successfully applied in peacetime to influence ordinary citizens. However, the term propaganda sounded too harsh and aggressive.
So what I did was to try to find some other words. So we found the word Council on Public Relations.
That's how the term we all know today was born. Manipulation of public opinion was still part of it, but now it served the interests of a brand rather than a political power. At the age of 28, Edward Bernays opened his own office in New York. His field was still new, but he never lacked clients. In the 1920s, the US market began to grow rapidly. A consumer society was taking shape, and the demand for PR services grew along with it. Naturally, clients started lining up to work with Edward Bernays. One day, the head of Venida, a company that sold hairnets, came to Bernays. After World War I, this accessory was going out of style, and sales had dropped sharply. Edward started by working with the media. He approached the chief illustrator of the women's magazine, Cosmopolitan, and casually brought up the topic of female beauty standards. The illustrator admitted he had always been a fan of the Greek hairstyle, which was impossible without a hairnet. Together, they sent letters to hundreds of magazines with a single question for illustrators: do you consider the Greek hairstyle beautiful? When they agreed, corresponding articles were published in the press. To win over officials, Bernays went to the New York Health Commissioner. During their conversation, he convinced the commissioner that hairnets were hygienic and important for food preparation. The commissioner embraced the idea, began promoting it to his colleagues, and even held a press conference. Bernays also visited the Department of Labor, persuading officials that hairnets ensured the safety of female workers. The final step was a bold, memorable event. Bernays went to the local port and arranged for one of the new ships to be named after the brand. That's how the slogan, "Venida rules the waves," was born, referring both to the sea and to wavy hair. Once everyone, from fashion designers to government officials, started saying that hair nets were not only fashionable but also practical, Bernays launched a simple advertising campaign, and sales of hair nets skyrocketed. One day, a bacon manufacturer came to Bernays for a consultation. He complained that his product was unpopular and sales were very low. Bernays began by analyzing the typical American breakfast at the time, which usually consisted of just toast and coffee. He realized that such a breakfast was too light, especially before a long, demanding workday. Looking for expert validation, Bernays consulted a doctor he knew and asked which breakfast was healthier, light or heavy. "Of course heavy," the doctor replied. "In the morning, you need a hearty meal to have enough energy for the day." Bernays was pleased to hear this, but he wanted confirmation from a larger group of experts. He sent letters to several thousand doctors with leading questions and received the responses he needed. He then shared the survey results with journalists, who spread the information to the public through the media. Only after that, Bernays launched the actual advertising campaign, presenting his clients bacon and eggs as the perfect breakfast. The campaign was so successful that bacon and eggs remain a classic American breakfast to this day. In 1924, Edward Bernays received a very high-profile assignment. His client was then President of the United States, Calvin Coolidge. The goal was to improve the image of a president who was seen as overly serious, reserved, and unapproachable. Bernays persuaded 34 movie stars to visit the White House and take part in an event called Breakfast with the President. This was an unprecedented example of mutual promotion, where both the politician and the actors shared their audiences with each other. Since then, hosting cultural elites has become a standard part of any politician's PR strategy. In 1929, the tobacco company Lucky Strike turned to Bernays for help. At that time, smoking was considered a male privilege. Women did smoke, but they usually did it at home, out of sight of others. However, millions of women were now working alongside men, and the tobacco industry saw a significant missed opportunity. They wanted to capture this attractive new female market. Bernays needed a way to make women feel comfortable smoking in public and on the streets. Sociologists helped. They explained that women were no longer satisfied with being housewives. They had become more active and were breaking into professions that had long been considered strictly male. Women at the time were happy with the shifting social roles in both family and society, so cigarettes could be framed as a kind of torch of freedom. Bernays immediately seized on the phrase and realized he could present the idea as an act of feminism. He connected with the well-known feminist Ruth Hale, recruited women who weren't professional models, gave them cigarettes, and provided simple instructions. On the annual Easter parade through Manhattan's main streets, the women, on cue, pulled out their cigarettes and lit up. The smoking women instantly caught the attention of photographers. The media published not only scandalous photos, but also articles challenging old social norms. Meanwhile, Lucky Strike launched a marketing campaign. As a result, the PR stunt caused a nationwide sensation for a month. Sales of Lucky Strike skyrocketed, and the image of women smoking in public became normalized. By the 1970s, in the US, there was roughly one smoking woman for every 2 smoking men. Around the same time, Bernays was working on the Lucky Strike campaign. Procter & Gamble came to him with a problem. Their soap sales weren't growing because children didn't like to wash. They hated getting soap in their eyes. Soap had become associated with negative feelings for kids, and Bernays needed to find a way to change that perception. After consulting with psychologists, he suggested that Procter & Gamble organize a children's contest for the best soap sculpture. As a result, nearly 23 million children submitted soap carvings. The numbers were incredible. Sales of soap skyrocketed, and soap carving remained a very popular children's hobby in the US for many years afterward. In the 1940s, brewers came to Bernays with a problem. Beer sales were low, the drink wasn't popular, and people preferred hard alcohol. Bernays started by consulting historians, gathering examples and facts about drinking culture. He developed the idea that hard liquor was for heavy drinkers and drunks, while beer was for moderate, respectable people who appreciated a refined beverage. To create an emotional connection with the product, Bernays decided to appeal to patriotism. He highlighted that America's founding fathers, the authors of the Declaration of Independence, also enjoyed beer. If they drank it, why shouldn't we? Armed with this strategy, Bernays successfully lobbied for laws allowing beer to be sold in regular grocery stores and even pharmacies, rather than just in specialized liquor stores, as all alcohol had been sold before. In 1954, Edward Bernays took on an unusual case. Representatives of U.S. Secretary of State John Foster Dulles and his brother, Allen Dulles, the CIA director, approached him. John Foster Dulles was a co-owner of United Fruit Company, an American agribusiness that owned land, railroads, and a power plant in Guatemala, and also exported bananas. When the pro-Soviet Jacobo Arbenz came to power, UFC's land was nationalized, causing massive losses for the company. To protect their investments, U.S. government officials needed the help of an experienced public relations expert. Naturally, Edward Bernays was considered the best at the time. He immediately realized that this commercial problem could be turned into a purely political project. Bernays sent a group of American reporters to Guatemala with instructions to film everything they saw and provide an honest, objective report. In reality, everything the journalists witnessed had been carefully staged by Bernays himself. Thousands of demonstrators took to the streets holding anti-American slogans, all choreographed for the reporter's arrival. Unaware of the manipulation, the journalists sincerely presented the situation as a threat to U.S. national security. With public opinion influenced, U.S. intelligence agencies felt justified in organizing paramilitary forces to restore democracy in Guatemala. As a result of the coup, a general took power and returned all confiscated UFC assets. Edward Bernays laid out his philosophy and ideas in 2 books. The first, published in 1923, was titled Crystallizing Public Opinion. It quickly became a must-read handbook for any serious PR professional and inspired countless successful campaigns, many of which results we still see today. For example, in 1954, Marlboro, which at the time was making women's filtered cigarettes, wanted to attract a male audience. That's when the legendary Marlboro Cowboy was created, a figure symbolizing masculinity, strength, and freedom, while still smoking only Marlboro filtered cigarettes. In less than a year, the brand became the most recognized in America and later around the world. A similar strategy was used by Coca-Cola. For decades, Santa Claus was seen as a strange, bearded old man in a green coat. But after a successful PR campaign in the 1930s, Santa became associated with Coca-Cola's signature red color. Another brilliant marketing move came from the PR team at De Beers, who learned from Bernays' book. Diamonds Are Forever is not just a James Bond movie, it's also the De Beers campaign. For 40 years before the film, they paid advertisers to tell the story that diamond engagement rings were an ancient medieval tradition, and that true love demanded a diamond ring. The movie starring Sean Connery was the campaign's climax, cementing the association between marriage proposals and De Beers diamonds. By the 1980s, De Beers' U.S. diamond sales had skyrocketed from $23 million to $2 billion. Bernays' crystallizing public opinion essentially turned citizens into consumers, driven by desire. But in 1928, his second book, Propaganda, was published, a real manual on how to manipulate people and exploit their fears in politics. Guess which European leaders found it particularly appealing? Both Hitler and Goebbels admired Bernays' work. In 1933, Joseph Goebbels invited an American journalist to his office and showed him his library. Among all the books, the works of Edward Bernays, a Jewish American, were prominently displayed. Tragically, his ideas ended up giving the Nazis a blueprint for the machinery of the Holocaust. Bernays himself believed his methods should only be used by educated people and only in democratic societies with fair competition. However, educated people are not always good, and there's no way to control who ultimately wields the tools of propaganda and for what purposes. The only thing Bernays could do was refuse to work with such people. He was a true patriot of the United States and turned down offers from foreign politicians multiple times. Even the Nazis invited him to work for them and were ready to completely turn a blind eye to his Jewish origins. During his life, Edward Bernays made a tremendous amount of money. Just his contract with United Fruit Company brought in $100,000 a year, which would be about $1 million today. How much he earned from other clients is anyone's guess. Bernays passed away in 1995 at the age of 104. In his final years, he remained active, attending shows, cracking jokes, and sharing memories. Those who knew him say he wasn't particularly charismatic or the life of the party. He wasn't great in one-to-one conversations. It was too small scale for him. Bernays thought in much broader terms. He always contrasted propaganda with chaos. It's impossible to imagine today's world without propaganda. It's everywhere, and it's often not just politics. Healthy living campaigns, traffic safety rules, store sales, YouTube videos, all of it is propaganda. Fighting propaganda is pointless, as arguing with a TV set. But in a world shaped by Edward Bernays and people like him, it's essential to approach all information with a critical mind.